Finding good questions is what I think philosophy is really all about. Finding a good question guides us. And for this I ask, can an evolutionary biologist believe in God without being a hypocrite? I say yes. To explain this, I'm going to have to explain the concept of a dialectic. Dialectic means many things. In this context, it's about conflict and confusion. I'm going to illustrate this dialectic using science and a scientific experiment to make the concept clear. Then I'm going to explain formal Western consciousness and how it differs from others using this dialectic. The scientific experiment is to show exactly what the dialectic is in concrete terms. This possible dialectic between reason and understanding is not only a conceptually useful schemata, but also a real physical phenomenon that occurs in science. I'm going to show a scientific paradox and why this paradox cannot be resolved using conventional methods to illustrate exactly what I'm talking about. Then I'm going to take the dialectic and I'm going to apply it to illustrate differences between the Old and New Testament, put the evolutionary debate into clearer context, as well as other things of equal interest. I've heard these ideas connected before. Connecting these two ideas is not new, but I don't think it's in print. I don't have a source to reference it, and I don't think it has been done with this degree of clarity. I'm going to use reason to explain all this so I don't have to appeal to any authority. Everything that I say will be self-evident. I'm going to talk about the concepts of reason and understanding and how they are fundamentally different and how they can collide with one another to create a dialectic. The thing that will really bake your noodle is how intuitive and easily understood this will all be. The scientific experiment is simple. If you can count, tie your shoes, and connect a light to a battery, you can understand this. And I'm going to explain the light and battery. It's mostly stuff you already know. It's going to be some new stuff pertaining to Immanuel Kant, but mostly I'm just going to turn some lights on. If you are accustomed to having one of these, an ordinary shovel to shovel through daily bullshit, the purpose of this video is to give you one of these. Understanding this dialectic will give you a better tool from which to evaluate truth, and it's all based on reason. This video essay is about the basic nature of truth itself, according to the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant. I'm not a videographer, so please forgive that the quality of this doesn't match many others. I spent about 6 months writing the script and preparing it, about 3 days producing it. The content will tie together and contextualize a lot of ideas that you've heard. And if you like the movie The Matrix, you have an interest in science, law, or the free man movement, you are the primary target for who I made this for. I'm going to show the real Matrix along the lines of the work of Immanuel Kant. I want to first frame this and show why I think it's important for other reasons other than the genius of Kant. Has truth in philosophy suffered the same fate as truth in politics, science, economics, history, law, and religion? Political fairy tales and mainstream media shape our political beliefs to accept or want more wars. Scientific fantasy is created to get us to accept more taxes and more regulations. It is part of the force that is moving us from a lawful society to one based on compliance. Economic fantasy creates the belief that we own our own property and wages. Sophistry, licentiousness, and intimidation underlie the operational doctrines of our modern courts as they change from dead law to living law that evolves from the bench. Education, attorneys, and courts keep the realities of our evolving and living legal system shrouded in darkness and confusion. Most people believe that an attorney is the same thing as a lawyer and have no idea how confused they are. Propaganda keeps us all confused and gets us to believe crazy things and warps our thinking away from what's really going on. The internet usually isn't any better. Our Western rulers have found that it is more useful for them to rule with propaganda and entertainment than it is to have men in uniform with machine guns standing on street corners, such as in Cuba. This makes us more productive, pay more taxes, and helps us believe that we are free. Our consciousness is very different today than in a time where we believed juries and jury nullification to be an integral part of a trial. Compliant people were weak and stupid, and wars had to be fought for a just cause. Cognitive dissonance is a psychological effect most people experience when they get confronted with the truth lies outside their normal world view. Dr. John McMurtry, a 9/11 truth investigator and philosopher at the University of Guelph, described the ruling group mind. Jacques Ellul, in his scholarly book on propaganda, states that only 8% of the population is immune to propaganda, and they didn't know why. He said there was no correlation between one's susceptibility to propaganda and intelligence or education. Bernays explained the role of propaganda and the effort behind it. Manufacturing Consent, Noam Chomsky, is another important work on propaganda that explains how consent for crimes of the state are created using the media. Most of this propaganda has been shaped to get us to think in ways that make us accept Bolshevik corporate communism, rather than to buy a certain brand of drink or toothpaste, and it's been of a covert rather than overt nature. It's been going strong, growing with technology for well over 100 years, in publishing, education, and media programming, as well as oligarch-financed and directed social justice movements. The power of simple repetition gets underestimated, particularly among the educated. They believe themselves immune, but no one can have their propaganda filters on all the time. It's counterintuitive that doctors can sometimes be more easily indoctrinated than ordinary people, as Jacques Ellul explains in his book on propaganda. Oftentimes, well-educated and respected people strongly believe things that can be easily disproven. It's why they want to censor. You censor to shape beliefs without telling outright lies, and the lie has only a tenuous connection to its teller. Every censor of political discourse or history is a liar. The people who shape reality are the people who control information and print the money. History shows us that these people are, in fact, communist social engineers. History proves it. Of fundamental importance to the creation of a communist state is that people must believe that science will eventually answer every question mankind has ever had or ever will have. For men to become gods, it must be believed that men, and not reason or understanding, are the gods. This is how our consciousness is evolving to accept rule by compliance rather than law. This has very important consequences in law and politics. The understanding of reality that people have forms a substrate for what they believe is right or wrong. Materialism requires governments to be the final arbitrator of right and wrong, because no law has a grounding in universalism. A compliant populace is easily led towards the gates of hell, which has always been the end result of states run by the laws of man. The threat of a purely materialistic society is that nothing can truly be said to be right or wrong, because life itself is nothing more than a composition of lifeless matter, operating in a giant chemical reaction, and the outcome could ultimately be predicted by science. Everyone complies because they know of no real reason not to. If reality is comprised only of pieces of lifeless matter interacting, then there can be no free will or conscience, because all of our fate is predetermined. Nothing can be said to be truly right and wrong. The end justifies the means in this world, and the law of nature and the law of communism says that might is right. This illustrates the cultural expressions of a society that wants to return to nature rather than to rise above it. And this is a fundamental difference between the left and the right. The left advocates a return to nature, and the right wants to rise above it. In this video, I'm going to talk about one of the most important books ever written, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Kant's works are relevant to diverse areas, from artificial intelligence to science and physics, as well as jurisprudence and art. Kant asks a complex and pivotal question related to knowledge in the first critique. He wants to suspend all of metaphysical inquiry until someone can explain how ideas like mathematics, that can be developed independently of empirical experience, can be universally known to be true. The material in Kant's first critique is difficult. The part I want to explain is actually better explained in his third critique, the critique of judgment. By critique, Kant meant to find the limitations in our thinking, how far reason, understanding, cognition, intuition, and judgment take us in comprehending the world that is around us. And this video is about judgments of truth. This all sounds complicated, but it won't be. I'm going to use this to explain why we are surrounded with bullshit everywhere we look. This is hardcore, pure NWR theory, and I've been seriously studying this for a long time. I've said the same things before, but not so clearly as this. Kant's argument is a fundamental argument against materialism. It's widely understood to be the best argument. Materialism is the philosophy of the banker and think tank created postmodern era. This seems like a reason why exposure to Kant's great work has been somewhat limited. It also may explain why he was so largely misunderstood, and he is very much misunderstood and quoted out of context. I'm going to do another video to make that clear. In Kant's day, the threat of materialist philosophy was well understood. In their Critique of Pure Reason, he gives us thinking about a paragraph in an 800-page book. He assumed that the effect that materialism would have on society was already well understood by any reader of his work. Nietzsche, the one often credited with this, was born 40 years after Kant had died. Kant was a metaphysician, a philosopher who attempted to explain the basic nature of truth and knowledge, called epistemology. His work became well known since the publication, and it's been studied ever since. In the first part of this video essay is on the very basic philosophy of science. I want to give a clear understanding of what science actually is in its most basic form, so that I can give a clear demonstration of Kant's basic idea in the Critique of Pure Reason. I'm going to illustrate the dialectic between reason and understanding that occurs in a particular scientific thought experiment. Then I'm going to apply this dialectic to the question of evolution. After this, I'll illustrate the same dialectic and laws that govern human society. Kant released his first Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. The second edition came out in 1787 to clear up misunderstandings of the first at the age of 63 years old. Prior to that, he was a notable researcher in fields of biology and anthropology, and was also the creator of the image we often see picturing the universe, as it must look from hundreds of light years away. These are often pictures of the Kant's nebular hypothesis, or as it is sometimes known as the Kant-Laplace hypothesis. After a long and notable career as a scientist and tutor to the wealthy, he turned to philosophy and wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, taking 10 years to do this, finishing the work at the age of over 70 years. He's been referenced by almost all major philosophers since this publication. Their ideas are discussed alongside and compared to his ideas. There is no shortage of philosophers who believe that his work is pivotal. He was a Protestant and in no way helped along with his social position or associations, and was born to a working-class family. Kant attempts to describe reality and the limits of reason in the context of all domains, the true, the good, and the beautiful. Kant is a giant in the history of thought, but his thinking is in direct opposition to postmodernism, although some would argue that he was its father. Kant is often misunderstood or misrepresented, and intentionally sometimes, I think. His fundamental ideas are revolutionary in the history of thought. Kantian project was primarily to place limits on reason itself and to resolve the conflict between God and science. Kant shows that reason itself can sometimes overextend its bounds, and this can warp thinking, causing reason itself to become misdirected. This can create a dialectic. We're going to have to swim around in the shallow end for a while I get us all on the same page with regard to exactly what science is. The guiding philosophy that underlies all science is known as the scientific method. The scientific method gives us a framework from which to design, conduct, and conclude results from experiments. And this is how we learn about the physical world. I'll give an example of a slightly oversimplified scientific experiment to illustrate how conclusions are reached by scientific experimentation. The scientific method consists of 3 parts, and it's the last part that's most frequently misunderstood. Step 1 is to create a falsifiable hypothesis. So for this demonstration, I'm going to say that it's going to be a container of water, and we want to determine if it freezes at 0 degrees Celsius or not. So step 1 would be to create this hypothesis, a falsifiable hypothesis. Either water freezes or it does not. Step 2 would be to perform the experiment, and that would be taking the container of water and putting it in a freezer and seeing if it does in fact freeze. Step 3 is to look at the container of water and see if it's frozen and draw conclusions from that. The tricky part is that if the water does actually freeze, then we can draw no hard conclusions. It only leads us to do more experiments on the freezing of water. If water does actually freeze, we have not proved anything, but also managed not to disprove the hypothesis. The results suggest that the hypothesis is a good one to try and falsify with another experiment. Someone else may perform the experiment that meets the above conditions and have water not freeze. Perhaps they try it without air pressure or without gravity. Maybe water doesn't freeze at 0 degrees in a zero gravity environment or in the presence of vibrations. Water freezing may be dependent on other factors, as far as we know. If the law that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius is successfully falsified, then we make up a new hypothesis and continue the process of trying to falsify it. If water is observed to freeze at 0 degrees Celsius, then we perform more experiments to meet the above conditions in such a way as to continue to falsify the hypothesis. We try to make another experiment that meets the above stated conditions and have the water not freeze. We're always trying to disprove the original assertion. If we cannot create an experiment where water doesn't freeze at 0 degrees Celsius, then we accept that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius as a scientific truth. This adopted rule is a maxim of understanding if it cannot be reasoned from known laws and is just an observation. Modern science is conducted with a lot more sophistication than the above slightly oversimplified example. The above example was created to show that truth is established by inference of not being able to nullify a hypothesis, not by being able to prove one. This does not create a law, it creates a maxim of understanding, which are used in the same way as laws and often referred to as such. So science illustrates falsehoods by finding out what isn't true. We find out what is actually true. We create understanding and maxims of understanding through empirical experience by performing experiments. Understanding forms half of this dialectic. The other half is reason. Physics can convert a maxim of understanding or a maxim of judgment into a law, something that is accepted as absolute truth using mathematical reasoning and deductions from something Kant calls a priori intuitions. An a priori intuition is an idea like the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line and that time always progresses, as well as deductions from these two propositions. Most basic principles of physics are based in reason. Newton's mechanical laws are based in reason, but the law of conservation of energy is really just a maxim of understanding because it cannot be deduced from reason alone. A priori principles only exist in physics and do not exist in other sciences. The scientific method can get us understandings and maxims of understandings because it's entirely based on observation. Theoretical physics gets us ideas from maxims of understandings and judgment generated by experiment into maxims of reasons, in other words, laws, by reasonable deduction. The best example of this is the old maxim of judgment that nature always takes the shortest route. It was later refined as the principle of least action and forms the basis for what we call classical mechanics, which is slightly different from Newtonian mechanics. In computer programming, the scientific method is called hacking. I can't recall who it was that said this so perfectly, but science actually hacks away at reality. Programmers use the scientific method only when trying to figure out what went wrong. The scientific method, developed by Francis Bacon, is the accepted method for observations because it's easy for us to expose lies or untruth, but difficult in principle to prove that something is true. This is why mathematical proofs are so difficult, and propaganda and general bullshit usually cannot stand up to even cursory examination. I'm not unscientific, but I like to know exactly what science and understanding can and cannot do for me. You need to know this to understand science. Everybody likes a hot cup of coffee in the morning before they go to work, And science gives us that comfort in life associated with material well-being. The faculty of understanding is the need and want part of consciousness or awareness. It is a slave to the senses. Understanding is the machine that's inside of each of us. Reason, on the other hand, gives us consciousness, freedom, practical moral sense, some physics, and all of mathematics. Reason makes us self-conscious of the machine. It makes us alive, and the ability to reason rather than just follow rules is the very thing that makes us conscious. Moral reasoning is said to separate us from the beasts by philosophers such as Kant. Personally, I think some of the beasts have reason and some of the people do not. Can science eventually determine absolute reality? If science cannot discern absolute reality, then a purely materialistic viewpoint of the world would be incorrect and an example of an overextended use of reason. Philosophers have been long saying that we are victims of an overextended use of reason. I'll now show another example of the use of the scientific method. I was given a demonstration to help them understand what science is and by extension what it is not, and to demonstrate the fact that science does not constitute absolute knowledge. Science requires that we examine phenomena that lies outside the domain of sensory perception in many cases. So to prove this, we're given a box that's painted and covered and it contains an object inside. We have no idea what's inside the box. It's up to the student to experiment and determine what object lies inside the box. Now, the possible objects that lie inside the box are those that lie within the limits of the student's imagination. Let's just suppose that the student's imagination is limited to this picture. So all of the objects that he or she has ever seen is in this picture. So we look at the box, we shake it around, we listen to it, and we try to discount objects that couldn't possibly be the object that is inside the box. You feel the reaction of the box as you shake it around, you listen to the sound. Immediately you realize that the object makes a loud sound when it strikes the side of the box, so it can't be the eraser. You now know something about the object that's inside the box. You know that it's not an eraser. It doesn't feel heavy enough to be the nut, so it's not the nut. It makes the same sort of sound no matter how it strikes the side of the box. So the material is homogeneous. Whatever the object is made of, it's made of the same material throughout. So it can't be the bottle of glue, it can't be the USB connector, or the key. It's too heavy to be the pen cap. It rolls around in 2 dimensions, so I can feel it rolling around the box when I do this. But if I do this, I see that it doesn't really roll. So it must be a circular object. So it must be the coin. It has to be the coin, given what we know. Now, the idea of it being a washer would never occur to the student because the washer lies outside the student's experience. Never seen a washer. Therefore, it's a coin. Now, as a scientist, the scientist would inform the engineers that it's in fact a coin that lies inside the box. And the engineers would draw conclusions from the fact that there's a coin inside the box. They know that if water gets inside the box, it won't affect the material properties of the object that's inside the box, because if a coin gets wet, it doesn't matter. Now, this is really how science is done. Now, in the case of the cell, the molecular cell, it's really too small for us to see. And for a long time, scientists assumed that the cell was a very simple biological object. but now they've learned that it's actually really, really complex. And the same goes with the atom. 100 years ago, they thought that the atom was composed of 3 particles, the proton, the neutron, and the electron. And now they've seen that the atom, in fact, contains many more objects than just protons, electrons, and neutrons. And Kant, in the Metaphysics of Natural Science, explains that the atom would get more complex as time goes on, as scientists did more and more experiments on it to try and determine its ultimate composition. Kant explained that they would never know the absolute composition of the atom, but that the models would get more and more complex as they tried to explain more and more experimental phenomena. So that is the nature of science. It doesn't lead us to absolute truth, but what it does is discount possibilities. And in that sense, by knowing what isn't true, we find out what is true. We are ultimately limited in our knowledge of the outside world by our senses. If we cannot see it, hear it, smell it, taste it, or feel it, then we're left only with our imagination. Imagination can only be based on prior experience. We can only imagine things that we've already seen. You can't imagine anything in the box except objects that you know of or combinations from prior experience. People assume that ideas like quantum mechanics and relativity can reach into a reality that is beyond sense, but really these are only models, tools that can only be an aid in ultimately describing the experiences of our sense perceptions. Theories must be verified by experiment, and this prevents the science from reaching beyond empirical experience and into the great beyond. Science is the model for what is inside the box. Are electrons real? What's a magnetic field? Gravity? No one actually knows. It's the hypothesis of the nut, assumed to be in the box, the hypothesis that no one has ever proved to be wrong. We may not know what electricity is, but we can see how much is flowing in a circuit for the purpose of how we understand it with an electrical meter. Evidence of what we imagine as electron flow is in the movement of the meter. Electron flow is converted to sense perception using the meter. A light bulb, radio, or television set gets us to see the effect of what we call electricity. None of these observations are observations of electricity itself, only its effect on our senses. Kant, in his short book, The Metaphysics of Natural Science, explains that for physics itself to exist, the world must be assumed to be comprised of small particles rather than homogeneous matter. Without this idea, science cannot stand on the laws of physics. Matter is already assumed to be composed of small particles before the game of physics even begins. Science is now structured across fields. There aren't many natural masters of all trades, such as in Kant's day. In Kant's day, scientists would deal with subject matter as diverse as, say, fire and anthropology. We now live in an age of specialists. Consider anthropology, since Kant was an anthropologist throughout most of his academic life. If we are to be systematic and non-self-contradictory in science, then what is true in anthropology must also be true in biology, and this must also be true of chemistry. What is true in chemistry must also be true of physics. What is found in experimental physics must be true in theoretical physics. Famous theoretical physicist Leonard Susskind, in a YouTube video, explains his field, which is theoretical physics. I've long lost the link to this video. He explains that whenever they run into trouble with their scientific experiments and things don't really quite add up, they always return to Maxwell's equations. Maxwell's equations are the well-known bedrock of science. Maxwell's equations completely describe the behavior of electricity and magnetism. No one can tell exactly what an electron or a magnetic field is, aside from a quantitative description of observations. Maxwell's equations explain electricity as we experience it. They completely explain the science behind electrical power, the internal operation of a computer, a radio, and all things electric that we can build or experience. These equations comprise the only model in science that works in both the quantum theory and in the theory of relativity, often attributed to Einstein. Maxwell's equations form laws. They are based on reason, although discovered with experiment. Science is a path to understanding the physical world. Science is built on one half, the understanding of this possible dialectic, that I'll illustrate. Sometimes physics bridges the gap and converts a mere maxim of understanding into a law through deductive reasoning. Reasoning forms the other half of this dialectic. But mostly science is just observed phenomenon, which creates only maxims of understanding. We know that it's true because that's what always happens, but we can't deductively show why it happens. I'm going to illustrate the basic Kantian hypothesis that the world does not exist as we see it, using very well developed and abstracted pure hard science, Maxwell's equations. I'm going to demonstrate a dialectic that occurs between reason and understanding in the scientific world with a physical example to explain this dialectic before I go on to use the dialectic to look at other things, so that we can get a concrete idea of what the dialectic actually is. I'm going to use an animation to explain this paradox. To illustrate this problem, I'm going to show some animations of how electricity works, as how we know and experience it. Maxwell's equations describe electricity and magnetism operating in any circumstance or system. Everything known about electricity and magnetism is summed up in those four equations. They are complex, and no one uses them in the above form. They are used to create abstract models, something Kant called schematism, and these abstract models help us understand the system that we are thinking about in a simple but perfect and complete way. Now I'm going to illustrate one of these models and explain it in the following animation. Here an electric circuit is illustrated. Potential energy is stored in the battery. The electrons, the negative charges, the black particles, have a propensity, a potential to move around the circuit to equalize the positive charges at the other pole of the battery, so that the net charge is zero. But they cannot always, because there is no path with a low enough resistance for many of them to do this. Nothing happens until we close the switch and the electrons flow in the circuit. As the electrons travel a path, they experience resistance in the light bulb. Resistance, the electrical form of friction, heats up the element in the light bulb, causing the element to glow and give off heat. Potential energy stored in the battery is being converted to heat and light in this circuit using the properties of the filament in the light bulb. The battery slowly drains as its potential energy is drained in lighting the light bulb. Its potential energy is converted to heat and light inside the light bulb, in the filament of the light bulb. This shows how energy is stored and used from a battery. There's another type of storage device used in electric circuits called a capacitor. A capacitor stores and releases energy much more quickly than a battery. Capacitors lose charge quickly, even when they are not on, which is why they don't get used as batteries. We can charge a capacitor with a battery, transferring a very small amount of potential energy from the battery to the capacitor. To charge the capacitor, we must flip the switch to give the electrons a path to flow. There's always a little bit of resistance in any circuit. Here it's represented by the rectangular black object in the circuit path. As electrons flow through the resistance, they lose energy and create heat. The energy from the battery is being transferred to the capacitor, but in the process some energy is lost due to the heat generated by the electrical resistance in the resistor. Eventually, the capacitor gets charged so it has the same voltage as the battery. The capacitor doesn't require much energy from the battery to become fully charged, so the battery has lost a very small amount of energy to fully charge the capacitor. Batteries can store a lot more energy than capacitors. Electricity stops flowing when the electrical pressure of the capacitor matches that of the battery. This pressure is called voltage. We can make an electric circuit that will charge one capacitor from another capacitor, but nothing happens until we close the switch to complete the circuit. Let's start the circuit with 3 units of charge on one capacitor. We close the switch to begin the charging process. Notice that we lose a bit of charge, the energy in the circuit, through the resistance. We started with 3 units of charge on one capacitor and finished with 1 unit of charge on each capacitor. We lost a unit of charge, a unit of potential energy, to heat buildup in the resistor. Everything works according to Maxwell's equations. Every circuit contains resistance. But if there was no resistance in a circuit, our circuit would look like this. Still, nothing happens until we close the switch. A circuit with no resistance cannot exist in experience. If Maxwell's equations, the foundations of science, are absolute truth, and they must express truth regardless of conditions. Maxwell's equations can be tested on a circuit that does not contain any resistance because some of the derived formulas do not contain resistance. So, what happens when we close the switch in this ideal circuit that should behave according to Maxwell's equations? When we close the switch, charge transfer takes place immediately. The charge is split between the two equal capacitors instantaneously. Capacitors store charge. A capacitor of 1 farad holds 1 coulomb of charge when it is fully charged from a 1-volt battery. The equations derived from Maxwell are Q, the charge, equals C, the capacitance, times V, the voltage. The energy in the capacitor is 1/2 times C times voltage, which is 1/2 CV squared. These two simple formulas are mathematically determined from Maxwell's equations. They change Maxwell's equations into a simple form for this simple circuit, but with no loss of information or accuracy. If the world truly exists as science shows us, then scientific laws are always valid. If science can lead us to absolute truth, possible truth outside of experience, then those laws can contain no possible contradiction. If there is a contradiction, then this accepted science does not reflect absolute truth. Maxwell's equations work for computer chips, power distribution systems, and in radio. They are valid in both the quantum and relativistic domains in physics. You cannot get energy from nothing is a scientific law. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. Most perpetual motion experimenters throughout history have been forgotten. Their ideas do not work, so they get forgotten, and the experiments get repeated. But it's not always clear exactly why their experiments aren't working properly. If these three laws, the charge equals the capacitance times the voltage, energy is 1/2 the capacitance multiplied by the voltage squared, and energy cannot be created from nothing, cannot all be true outside of possible experience, then science cannot be said to lead us toward an absolute truth. Not everything can be explained with science. We can test the three laws to see if we can get a contradiction. If we make a thought experiment of possible conditions that may exist outside of experience, yet still be valid according to Maxwell's equations. In experience, we know that all electric circuits contain resistance. Sometimes it can be very low, but it is always present, even with superconductors. It can be practically zero with superconductors. This circuit does not have any resistance. We can test the Maxwell's equations and see if they reflect absolute truth outside of possible experience. In this circuit, the capacity of the capacitor to hold a charge is 1 coulomb per volt. This capacity is measured in farads after Faraday. If we increase the voltage on the capacitor, a greater charge builds up on its plates. If we apply a 1-volt charge to a 1 farad capacitor, it will hold 1 coulomb of electric charge, which is one heck of a lot of electrons. If we charge this 1 farad capacitor to 2 volts, we have 2 coulombs of charge built up on the plates. The charge of 2 volts is held on one of the capacitors because the switch is open. No current flows, nothing happens in this circuit. We close the switch and half the charge immediately goes over to the other capacitor. The charge transfer occurs instantly because there is no resistance. There is no energy loss because there is no resistance. Resistance is like electrical friction and creates heat when current travels through it, and heat is energy, so energy is lost. If there is no resistance, no energy can be lost. This circuit is an ideal circuit in that it contains no resistance and lies outside the range of possible experience. Let's see how those scientific laws that we accept as being absolute truth hold up in this thought experiment. The circuit in this state has a 1 farad capacitor charged with 2 coulombs of charge, electrons. The capacitor was charged with a 2-volt battery. The amount of energy can be calculated. It's 1/2 times the capacitance times the square of the voltage, which is 2 joules of energy. So there's 2 joules of energy stored in that left-hand capacitor. So here's the kicker. Since energy cannot be created from nothing, we expect the total energy in the circuit to be the same after we close the switch. The charge will just be divided between the 2 identical capacitors. The single 1 farad capacitor was charged with 2 coulombs of charge from being charged with a 2-volt battery. So the total energy stored by the first capacitor is 1/2 of its capacitance multiplied by the square of the voltage, according to Maxwell's equations. This means that 2 joules of energy are in the first capacitor before the switch is closed. So let's see what happens when we close the switch. When the switch closes, the charge is instantly divided between the 2 capacitors. There's no time delay because there's no resistance. This happens instantaneously. The charge is constant. It's just divided between the 2 capacitors. Connecting the 2 1 farad capacitors like this makes the total capacity of the circuit 2 farads. The voltage is halved because the charge must remain constant and the capacity is just doubled. According to the same energy formula, we have 1 joule. So in the initial circuit we had 2 joules of energy. In the final circuit we have 1 joule of energy, with Maxwell's equations not being able to explain the loss of energy. Now this circuit is a thought experiment that lies outside experience, but Maxwell's equations in this particular application do not include resistance, so we expect them to work within experience with circuits that have resistance as well as circuits that do not have resistance. So what just happened? When the box is closed, we make experiments and observe the following laws, which are in no way self-contradictory. We have the 2 formulas from Maxwell's equations. These equations are accepted as fact in physics, but there are some instances with electrical engineering and power systems where we run into this problem. Now, I don't know that much about that end of it, and it's really not the point of this video. The point of this video is to show a contradiction that lies within Maxwell's equations. Everything in the physical experiential world adds up, at least so far. When the box is open to look beyond experience, our laws become self-contradictory. They do not tell us what is in the box, only what we can observe. The scientific laws of Maxwell's equations only apply to the world of experience, give no hint regarding absolute truth in any sense. I've just proven that science cannot meet the requirement of showing us absolute truth by showing that science can be self-contradictory outside the bounds of possible experience. This creates a dialectic at the very base of science. I will return to this example again, so don't worry if you didn't get it perfectly. If reason and understanding and science can be dialectical on the very purest side, then we cannot say that either reason or understanding permits us to see the world as it truly is. This is a demonstration of the basic Kantian hypothesis, that the world cannot exist as we see it. And this demonstration wasn't known in Kant's time. I want to talk about the Kantian view of reality. At first exposure, it might seem like the air in Kant's workspace contained the fumes of undried solvents, glue causing Kant to hallucinate into an unknown world. He gets mislabeled as a solipsist often. A solipsist just thinks everything is in his head and that he could have no knowledge of actual reality. Kant did not believe this, but is often stated to have believed this. He goes off his path to explain this error in his book. Then he rewrote the book to clear this up, and as well as some other things. His fundamental ideas are very much outside the box where most people's thoughts normally reside. Kant actually said that the idea of purpose was the thing that we create in our mind, not reality itself. We use imagination to create purpose, which helps us create maxims of judgment to guide our inquiry. A scientist, when first dissecting a frog, for instance, may assume that every part of the frog he sees has a purpose, and this would guide his inquiry and probably prevent him from making mistakes or bad assumptions. Now, this is only a maxim of judgment, that he assumes that all of the guts that inside the frog actually have a purpose. The maxim of judgment is in no way empirically connected to the frog. It's something that exists in the mind of the scientist. It exists in the mind of the scientist only to guide inquiry, until it's shown to be incorrect. Now, according to Kant, time and space are modes of perception and not things in themselves. You can only have enough space to put something in, and you can only perceive time and how things change inside your body and the external world through sensory perception. Time and space are not like the objects they contain. Kant believed that in the ultimate truth in things, time and space must be considered as being subjective modes of perception and not things in themselves. This does not mean subjective in the sense that we want them a certain way, but subjective in the sense that we all perceive them in a certain way, both in thought and sense perception. This requires a bit of thought to fully digest. He provides an example of a straight line. The idea is never experienced. There's no such thing as a perfect straight line in nature. We universally accept that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line axiomatically. No one has ever proved it. For those who want to bring relativity into this, I refer them to Russell's book on relativity and his last chapter on Kant. Kant's most essential argument is that we are born with intuition of space and time. Our systems are pre-wired to cognize space and time, making knowledge of space and time what is termed a priori. A priori means both prior to experience and necessary for experience. He said that it would be an incredible coincidence if this perception for which we are pre-wired reflected absolute reality. We cannot know that the world exists as we see it. Science sees it. You can look at it this way. We could all be part of a huge computer simulation, like Neo in the movie The Matrix. Sensory perceptions in science, which only belong in space and time, do not contain the tools to solve this riddle. Neo could have never known he was inside of a matrix without being outside at some point in his experience. On the other non-objective side of things like math and morals that do not manifest as objects, Kant explains that we can know truth. The tools are already there in our minds. Math is built only on our a priori perception of space and time. Our natural moral sense is best expressed as Kant's categorical imperative and in the single commandment of the New Testament. This makes math and morals, time and space independent. They are true no matter where or when, and they are non-objective because they do not pertain to objects in space. Math is created from two axioms, one being that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line in space, and arithmetic, which comes from the perception of time. First you have one, then another, then another. These two ideas form the basis of mathematics, and logically speaking, math could be developed without the creator having any experience whatsoever in any kind of physical or empirical reality, working only from these two axioms. Math is subjective because it is not dependent on objects in the physical world, and is as a result of our a priori intuition. We perceive time and space the way they are. Discoveries in math are created by empirical experience triggering imagination, but it can all be built on the a priori concepts. Morals also work from reason. Kant is often criticized for his moral ideas. He's criticized for saying that lying is always wrong. Well, Kant is writing laws that would be in silent operation in a place that we can imagine as heaven. No one would ever lie in heaven. It's those ideal laws that reason requires us to follow. But Kant was a Christian and understood that he, as well as others, were governed by this life, the God of matter, Mammon, as well as the God of reason, Jesus Christ, and the understandings of the Old Testament. And the second is like, namely this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There is none other commandment greater than these. Mark 12:31. Laws of math, such as 1 + 1 = 2, are known to be true from reason. The law of gravity, that two bodies with mass are attracted to each other in space, is known from reason as well. because physicists have deduced a law from scientific observation with deductive reason. Physical principles, such as the one that states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, is not intuitive and is therefore only a maxim of understanding, not quite a law. One truth is known deductively, 1 + 1 = 2, that is, we start with a law and logically deduce another. This is reason. The law for energy is only observed and cannot be deduced using a priori intuitions and concepts, so it can only be considered as a maxim of understanding in the truest sense. I've used the two-capacitor problem to illustrate the Kantian hypothesis. Proving the Kantian hypothesis is impossible because it lies at the very edge of reason. The two-capacitor paradox shows that there is something wrong with Maxwell's equations that cannot be resolved, yet they work everywhere in science. Science marches on with this paradox. Science exists because it pays, not because it leads us toward truth. It creates comfort and safety, the two reasons we have a society, and therefore the ability to practice science. Kant explains that we can adopt a purely materialistic view of the world, or not, and that the scientific-based knowledge would be unaffected. History shows us what a materialistic view of the world leads to, starting with the ancient atomists and recently ending with the Bolsheviks. Kantianism and the two-capacitor paradox are not my ideas. The two-capacitor paradox has been a source of curiosity for well over 100 years. Every few years, a scientist or an engineer comes up with a solution, and that solution is later regarded as incorrect by subsequent examination. It's my contention that this problem does not have a mathematical or scientific solution, or any solution, and that Kantianism explains why. I explain in the following 2 slides. The problem in a nutshell is this. The 2 laws, E = cv² and Q = cv, are both time-independent laws. They have no time variable. When the idea of time is removed, these 2 equations can no longer be a reality. They require that we look at them through a time lens to be true, even though they are not dependent on time. This suggests that not only are we handicapped through the use of imagination by way of imagining charges and electrons, which may or may not be real, but our cognitions may be handicapped due to experience, since knowledge itself requires experience, and experience is dependent on time and space perceptions. The experiment fails, and those 2 equations become useless when we look inside that box. My hypothesis is that we cannot solve this paradox because Kant is correct in his, that time is a mode of perception and not a thing in itself, and that time and space, the a priori perceptions, intuitions as he calls them, are necessary for knowledge. Time being removed in this thought experiment is something a physical experiment could never duplicate. A conventional Maxwell's equation solution to this problem cannot be found. The Kantian hypothesis seems to explain why. This dialectic that can occur between reason and understanding shows that the world cannot exist as we actually see it. And this was Kant's statement. Our minds get tricked in other ways. We overextend reason when we ask where or when regarding the beginning or the end of time or space. Time and space are modes of perception and not things in themselves. They are not like the objects they contain. And asking and thinking about the end of time or the beginning of time or the physical ends of the universe is something that lies beyond our experience. And when we do this, we overextend reason. The ends and beginnings of space and time are outside of our perception and therefore can never be known. These differences in thought process, reason, and understanding often lead to misunderstandings and conflict. I want to apply this dialectic to the non-physical realm of things, as well as to the idea of progressive genetic evolution. Kantian dialectic between reason and understanding has many applications that are not scientific. The stuff on the dialectic, I want to set it aside for a moment to explain why I made this video. Another reason why I made this video. On September 11th, 2001, I walked into a bar in Peterborough around 9:30 a.m. in the morning. The first plane had already crashed into the first building. And we were thinking it was an accident. We were wondering how many people got killed and stuff like this. But then the second plane hit, and that changed everything. It was no longer an act of God or an accident. It was obviously a deliberate act of man. No one left the bar, and everyone was glued to the screen. Both of the buildings collapsed. During that day, while we were in a state of confusion and disbelief, we were told what we should think. One, the mechanics of what we were to believe were precisely articulated by one of the witnesses prior to any investigation and before the dust had even settled. And we were told to believe who did this. There was an evil mastermind, Osama bin Laden, working from a cave in Afghanistan, creating and executing this plan to overtake the air defenses of the United States. I left the bar after hearing that everyone believed all this. I was labeled as a conspiracy theorist for not buying it. I had to ask maybe 100 people in the subsequent months before I met someone who agreed with me and pointed me to Alex Jones. A week or so after 9/11, an engineering paper consisting of several pages with detailed diagrams that explained this new concept of pancake theory was published. It shouldn't surprise anyone that pancake theory is a forbidden topic in civil engineering classes, as many engineers have told me when I worked for 9/11 Truth, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Reason performs a regulative function. It tells you that the comic book story and the comic book villain are both nonsense. But trauma-based mind control works around reason because trauma suspends normal thinking patterns. We go into a fight or flight based mode. In this state of confusion, truths get implanted into our consciousness. This is what they do. They start off with nonsense, and they work logically from there. They told us the stuff of comic books while we were in a state of trauma. I was not a watcher of current events in those days. Some people bought it all, and I think that most pretended to go along with it just to go along to get along. Al Pacino's character, the devil, in the movie Devil's Advocate explains it. For some, when he says, "Vanity is my favorite sin." Many people were likely operating from fear that if they spoke the truth, it would upset the balance in their lives. Others may believe that there is honor among thieves. Most people suffer from the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance, an inability to believe what is outside their normal bounds of experience. It chose to be unconscious of this dialectic and the fact that reason alone shows the official version to be impossible. Most of us are just driftwood on the ocean, and most of us see ourselves this way. We may not be able to change anything, but we should try and save our own minds. There's a civic responsibility to maintain freedom in a freedom-based society, and this civic responsibility exceeds voting when none of the candidates stand for freedom or the reason side of things. So you may have to do something else. Share this video, share other videos, start a YouTube channel. To me, the significance of 9/11 was not the loss of lives, although this was terrible. It wasn't the demonstration of the power of the propaganda state and the ease at which countries could be led to war. It was a demonstration of the war on reason itself, which was brought into full view. 9/11 is the mindfuck of the century, and it's biblical. World War III is happening, and it is a war on the mind in the East and the West, and it's a violent war of attrition in the Middle East. The propaganda state can easily be seen to be at war with reason itself. The terrorist attacks have always been exposed to be inside jobs, and it's always been obvious to anyone who looks at the evidence and applies reason. Many people point evidence to the notion that the architects of the West were not Christians. I don't know if this is true or not. No one can say for sure who the ruling classes are, or find out what their true motivations are. There's always an inner group within the inner group. There's always a secret group of insiders within any secret group of insiders. The world operates by laws just as any system does, or else it fails to operate. Laws are based in holy books, and governments get their sanctions from the church. Laws create and define a nation, and they are necessarily based on currency. Money and law in the understanding side of things are one and the same. You break a law, and you are required to take responsibility, and you do so with payment. Note that you are charged. is part of a law that is shrouded in secrecy, and all prisons are debtor prisons, then all man-made laws are laws of understanding. These man-made laws of understanding are not universal and depend on factors like geography and culture. The only possible source for universal law comes from reason. It is from reason and not understanding that we have morality and laws. Understanding is only a slave to biological needs. Reason is the thing that separates the men from the beasts. Statutes are things we understand. The reason part of law is stuff we already know. Jurisprudence is said to be a science, not an art, so it starts with known precepts because it is a science. This part of law must be written, as Kant compares a boat tied to a dock. If the boat is not tied down securely, it would drift away. Laws must be written, and these laws come from holy books. That's why religion is important, even if you are not an atheist. The man-made laws of understanding and commerce cannot violate the holy laws if the boat is to remain tied. Christianity, in its most fundamental sense, formally acknowledges reason and brings it into law. The obedience to God no longer consists of observance of a series of maxims of understanding. The 10 Commandments are empirically necessary for society and must be understood. Christ made the ultimate sacrifice to bring reason into law. Christians are governed by statutes and reason, as well as understanding, such as in the case of the commandments. Conscience is the final arbitrator. The single commandment of the New Testament gives us moral reason. Christianity is fundamentally different from any other religion, including atheism, in that it brings reason into law. By and large, it was not Christians who traded in slaves, although there are a few exceptions. The other religions, especially atheism, create fertile ground for the human behavior that suggests we are lower than the beasts. It was laws that do not violate Christianity that created the West and the places in the world where everyone wants to live. Of fundamental importance is the Trinity. In the law courts, Christian doctrine is manifested in the Trinity. The Father, understanding and the law, the Son, reason and the defense, and the Holy Ghost, conscience, the jury, form the structure. The jury, conscience and morality, sees the court is not permitted to eat from the tree of knowledge in obtaining a conviction. Eating from the tree of knowledge is to use the letter rather than the spirit of the law. The final arbitrator in all this is the jury. By jury nullification, not only the accused, but the law itself is put on trial. This is the jurisprudence that the West was founded on, and it's all based on Christian law. In its true form, it is fair, it's reasonable. The Trinity keeps the powers that be in check, and is why the New World Order hates Christianity so much. Christians are being killed in non-Western countries such as Africa and genocided out of existence with the immigration policies of the West. This is a stated fact. In making moral judgments, we're often bound by the laws of God, reason for Christians, and those of the material, understanding world. One cannot truly serve two masters, and that's why Christians are born sinners. It's not like we did anything wrong, it's just the nature of reality. Commercial law has a different tradition. It is well known as the law merchant, and the law merchant underlies the commercial laws of man, the laws of understanding. In commercial law, when being persecuted by the government, people have no rights, because it's a maxim in commercial law that a debtor has no rights. We have complied with the debt creation under a fraudulent monetary system whose creators have the goal of destroying Christianity, creating the Tower of Babel, and a world of understanding. The law structure that is emerging is based on understanding and is overtaking reason, as we can all see clearly. Most people in our society operate by compliance based on understanding rather than law based on reason. Communists want a compliant group of citizens. Tribunals are now emerging in Ontario, Canada. A law system based purely on understanding has justice. And Plato in the Republic explains this concept. It means just us. Laws are in place to protect the innocent. Bad laws do a bad job of this. Being compliant does not protect you from bad laws. Compliance is a breeding ground for bad laws, and bad laws are bad because they punish good people. The compliant just get led to the killing fields. A world based on laws of understanding rather than reason or conscience requires that God does not exist, there is no conscience, and that all knowledge will be eventually explained by science. This puts men into the position of gods. Material societies without God do not survive. They are unreasonable. Reason dies, then tens of millions of people die. We have seen this in communist revolutions over the past century, particularly in China and Russia. On the question of evolution, we can see that the theory is based on observation and creates an understanding. This does not create a law, only a maxim of understanding. For science or any kind of thought, guiding principles are required, and these are the maxims that are adopted. Adopting this maxim in the pursuit of life sciences seems to guide us along to further knowledge. You head for the North Pole, but maybe not expect to meet Santa Claus or prove that evolution is absolute truth. A materialist society must have evolution explain the origins of life to eliminate any idea of a creator. Without a creator, men are free to write laws that suit them, ones that help their friends and harm their enemies. Evolution comes from the understanding side of science. It looks at physical evidence and concludes that genetic evolution must be true because that's the way things look. Physics, on the other hand, which is based on reason and a priori knowledge, creates a different view of evolution, and many people argue against it from a reason perspective. Although it is a maxim of understanding that people in the life sciences use to guide their inquiry, does not make it absolutely true. Physicists and mathematicians often say it's impossible. Moral reason requires a God, because reason has no principles of its own. Understanding works from observations, and will not find evidence of God because God is not in space and time. This dialectic between reason and understanding is the source of confusion in the debate on the existence of God. The debate between evolution and creation may ultimately contain another dialectic between reason and understanding, in the same way that the capacitor paradox I showed earlier does. Reason says it's impossible and understanding says it must be. An evolutionary biologist can practice science all week and use the evolutionary guiding principle in his work, while still acknowledging the importance of reason on Sunday. He knows that no one can explain why we know the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, or the ideas of mathematics, or the ideas of right and wrong. We do not learn these from empirical experience. In a more abstract observation, science is no closer to explaining consciousness now than it was during its inception when Francis Bacon created the scientific method. The New World Order, created by debt, and the understanding that that debt is real, is destroying reason. Under New World Order laws, no defense lawyer will be permitted and no forgiveness will be given to Christians. Christ is believed to be a false idol, and under Noahide law, all Christians are to be killed. Compliance permits it to continue, and counterfeit currency is the blood that runs through the veins of the New World Order. Change things, we have to change the money system. Communists want to teach that evolution is absolute truth. People understood the importance of this evolutionary debate 50 years ago in principle. But people are now victims of the public education and the fluorinated water, and they cannot recognize this threat or recognize that there are both sides in this debate. Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, in only a single paragraph, he describes the perils of society that would result from a belief that society and reality, in fact, is mechanistic, entirely governed by nature. He says that this problem and what it leads to is well known, and that we could have it either way. There is no way of proving it one way or another, since perception and reality, being two different things, form the basic foundation of Kantian philosophy. I want to illustrate the application of recognizing the difference between reason and understanding. It should be obvious how this sometimes leads to a dialectic, so let's apply some reductionism and see where it takes us. Can this dialectic be used to analyze the question of honor among thieves? It's a new idea that came to me when I was making this video. I haven't had really a lot of time to mull it over. I think that the answer is yes, but I may be a victim of over-systemization, and people said that Kant himself was a victim of over-systemization. I don't think the criticism of Kant is valid. Thieves tend to work from the understanding side of things and not reason. They violate the basic moral law as soon as they become thieves. They exist only within a world of nature, and therefore without morality and rational law. I think that a lot of people running things essentially believe that there is honor among thieves. We can compare the understanding side of consciousness and the reason side of consciousness. From the empirical world, we have space and time and biological requirements. Things that are not of this world are things like freedom, consciousness, morality, and virtue. On the understanding side of things, we have the props and the stage for the play. On the reason side of things, we have the lines of the play. Understanding gives us the beast within man, and reason is what separates men from the beast. Understanding gives us scientific observations and the scientific method. Reason gives us mathematics. Experimental physics and all other sciences are based on statistical analysis, regressive analysis, looking at observations and then trying to deduce what may or may not be true from those observations. A perfect example of this science is thermodynamics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. We know this, but we don't know why this is true. It's strictly an observation, a maximum of judgment. On the reason side of things, we have mathematics and theoretical physics that explains observations with reason and math. It's deductive and progressive as opposed to statistical and regressive. Intuitive physics, Newton, Maxwell, and classical mechanics are from the reason side of things. In understanding, the end justifies the means. Might is right. Might is right was proven wrong by Rousseau in The Social Contract. We have laws of nature, the beast within, on the understanding side of things. On the reason side of things, we have logos. Love thy neighbor as thyself as universal law. It's these laws of reason that elevate man above the beast. Now, while operating in reality, men have to obey both kinds of laws. We have to obey the commercial laws of understanding as well as the common law to all men. So, all men are born sinners because we cannot serve two masters. On the understanding side of things, we have the Old Testament laws. Debt creates jurisdiction, and debt makes dead men and living laws. And the New Testament laws, living men and dead written laws are the law. On the understanding side of things, evolutionary law. Laws evolve to help the friends and harm the enemies of the powers that be, because there is no universal law. On the understanding side of things, we have compliance. With reason, we have New Testament laws, living men and dead written laws. Conscience is the final arbitrator, and we have lawfulness and conscience as opposed to compliance. On the understanding side of things is where attorneys work, and on the reason side of things is where lawyers work. If total destruction of reason takes place, then we are left with only justice, where the powers that be help their friends and harm their enemies, and the courts of law become only memories, as Plato explains in the Republic. Reason could be lost forever, and almost all of humanity may be nothing more than farmed labor. And I think this is the goal of the current communists that are in power. I think that a response to this is to live in a way such as to not deserve it. If you like this video essay, please download it and put it on our YouTube channel. Monetize it if you want. Just do not change the content, and thank you for listening.